and thank everybody for being here. I really appreciate the time that you're dedicating to this. And I want to introduce one of the tools that I'm going to be using during the presentation. So some of you might be familiar with this already. It's the quick Google sort of question and presentation view. So you can see right up there, there's a small link. If you type in that link, it'll take you to a web page where you can ask questions at any time during the presentation. I can go ahead and present your question to the rest of the group and address it either there in the moment or when we get to a nice stopping point. I like this because it provides a way for you all to engage, even though, you know, we're behind our respective screens and our mute buttons here. So it's a little bit easier for me to get some feedback from you all. So feel free to use that as much as you'd like. I'll go ahead and share this link with you too in the comment section, just so everybody's got it. That is, if I can find my little chat dialog box. There we go. Perfect. Okay, that should be in the chat box for you there. And awesome. I'm going to go ahead and get started. As you have questions, feel free to pop them right in there. So hi, everyone. My name is Jack Krewson, and I'm the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Kairos Academies in St. Louis, Missouri. With stay-at-home orders in place nationwide and the worlds of work and education getting flipped on their heads, the response from schools across our country has ranged anywhere from an extended summer break to low accountability packets to a hodgepodge of digital learning resources. And if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a student, you have probably noticed or have some experience with some of these methods. I think mixed is a fair and maybe overly kind word for the results that we've seen. And I worry day over day as an educator that we're going to be in a place as a country where we have a generation of kids who's 6 months behind. And that disproportionately, that gap is going to be affecting already at-risk groups and groups who are already behind in terms of their educational attainment and outcomes. And so I'm here today to talk a little bit about, you know, why our students at Kairos have been able to thrive in working conditions that have left most adults in the fetal position, right? So as you'll see in the coming slides, you know, we never intended to develop a school model that was virtual. And I think the real learning from this moment in our history isn't about how, you know, some schools are more prepared for the apocalypse than others. It's about what the pandemic is showing us about the failures of our traditional education system. Its inflexibility, its inability to recognize and embrace differences between students, and its failure to teach students how to sort of constellation of skills that builds up to being able to set and achieve their own ends, right? And I think that's why you see students struggling at this moment in time, is because we haven't helped them build those skills. But to understand this, I'm going to start at the beginning with a little bit of background, right? So where did Kairos come from? What is our school model? Why is it that our kids are set up to thrive in this way? And then I'm going to talk about what I think the learning should be moving forward beyond the stay-at-home orders, right? So when we return to brick and mortar operations, what are some lasting changes that I think we need to see across the education system, not just because they've helped students be successful during a crisis, but because I think they're fundamental to tapping into who they are as human beings and to help prepare them for a life of opportunity. So starting at the beginning, Kairos began in my classroom and my co-founder's classroom when we were teaching at Jennings and Normandy high schools here in St. Louis, North St. Louis County. If you're familiar with the St. Louis area, those are two of many schools that are not living up to a standard of excellence that we'd want to see in our education system. And what we saw there was that the cardinal virtues of those schools and of schools today broadly were not learning and curiosity or any of the values or sort of lofty ideals that draw educators to this field in the first place. The cardinal virtues, if you were an alien and you were popped into the school and you had to say, what does this school care about? What does this place care about? What is education for? Well, it's control and it's compliance, right? So kids were told every minute of every day where to sit, what, how, and with whom to study, if they could speak or go to the bathroom or get water. We train them to be followers, right? And then we ask them to go out into the real world and be leaders. And that's a cognitive dissonance that's sort of hard for me to bend my mind around. So every fall, right, I would get a call from graduated students, right, diligent students, the ones who stayed after school for tutoring and corrected old tests and did everything right. And they would say, hey, Mr. Krewson, this isn't working out. They're off in college, they're off in their first job, and if any of your educators, what a heartbreaking conversation that can be, right? But it was never really, I'd ask, what's this about? It was never really about the academics, although that was part of it, right? It was that for the first time, they were thrown into this world of choice, this world that looked nothing like their K-12 education, right? Whether they be in college, whether they be in their first job, they had to figure out the whole constellation of skills that is managing yourself. And I bet if every adult in this room is being honest with themselves, they struggle with those things on a daily basis today, right? These are very hard skills, and you have to give students the leeway to make choices and to practice and to fail to really get good at them. And we just hadn't done that. And so where I want to start with is that this cognitive dissonance, this mismatch between what schools look like today, schools that are supposed to prepare people for the real world, and what the real world looks like, that mismatch has a really ugly history, right? St. Louis public schools were developed in the mid-19th century, and here's the vision of those schools as laid out by one of its founders. So this is a quote: ideally, 99 students out of 100 are automata, careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom. This is not an accident, but the result of substantial education, which, scientifically defined, is the deliberate subsumption of the individual. I'll say that again. Scientifically defined is the deliberate subsumption of the individual. That was William Torrey Harris. He was the superintendent of St. Louis Public Schools from 1868 to 1880. He's the U.S. Commissioner of Education later from 1889 to 1906. He's a person who had a big hand in setting up sort of the progressive school era, large national school system. And the captains of industry at the time, their intentions were very clear, and they stated them. They set up a system of education that intentionally turned kids into cogs, right? And while the world has changed around it, that system hasn't changed much. And that's why our schools still operate, frankly, like the factories of 100 years ago. That's what those schools were designed around. That's why our students move from class to class on a single factory bell schedule, right? That's why we've standardized the curriculum so that each child learns the same thing at the same time, so that when, Becky here in the bottom left is out on the production line, well, you can pop Jack right in. He's going to know the same stuff. He's going to be able to sort of a replaceable widget, right? That's why we focused on rote memorization over critical thinking. Don't question, step in line, right? That's why students are still organized by their date of manufacture, their age, when we know that often age isn't what two students have most in common, right? I know third graders who are ready for fifth grade math, and eighth graders who are still working through sixth grade concepts. And of course they're different, right? Every student is different. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we shouldn't shame students into thinking that they're dumb because they're moving at a different pace than the rest of the class, right? We shouldn't bore students by requiring them to go over material that they've already mastered. We should personalize to meet those needs. And I'm going to talk about sort of how we do that. This system hasn't really changed much at all in the last 100 years. And wrapped up in this idea, I don't have a slide specific for this until we get to the end, is also this idea of a segregated school system that comes with this, right? So our schools today are almost as segregated as they were 100 years ago. And it is no surprise to me that we live in the 10th most segregated city in the United States when you look at the composition of our schools in St. Louis. This is true largely across the country, but if you are white and high income, you go to school with other students who are white and high income, right? If you are African American and low income, you go to school with other students who are African American, low income. You can take any one of these variables and flip them. Everyone is going to school with people who are nearly identical to them. And of course, we're not going to be able to learn to work across lines of difference if we're not exposed to people who are different than we are. And that's sort of another thing that's wrapped up in this idea of the factory model of education and why it's failing students. So a couple of these things come together, skipping over some of the details to talk about who we are and what we do, which is Kairos. Kairos is this word, it's ancient Greek, it means the opportune moment or time, right? And so if we have this mismatch between what's going on in the world, the kind of world that our students are going to inhabit, the kind of skills they're going to have, they're not rote memorization, right? They're not being a standardized widget that can pop into a factory production line. Those jobs are going if they're not already gone, right? Those kinds of jobs that rely on those skills are being automated away. And the only thing we know for sure about what our kids are going to do when they grow up is that they're going to rely on those traits that make them uniquely human, right? They're higher order cognitive capacities. There are things, thankfully, that robots can't do as well as people, right? They're not very good critical thinkers. They're not very creative. They're not very good at working in relationship with other people. And so that's what we focus on at Kairos. We think it's the right time to start restructuring an education for that. Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit, that's sort of where we come from, why we exist. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a Kairos education looks like. And the first part I'm going to hit here is what we call personalized learning. Personalized learning really recognizes this idea that every student is different, right? And that if we are moving 30 students in a class at a time through a single set of material day over day, we are inevitably failing them, right? Because half of the students are ahead of that pace just let's take a really simple variable like your readiness level, where you started, right? Half of the students are ahead of that and half of the students are behind. And so you are, maybe you're hitting 10% in the middle, 15% in the middle, 20% in the middle if you're really lucky. But the truth is there's a range of readiness levels in any classroom, especially a classroom that draws from a diverse background of students who came from a diverse group of schools. Anywhere from, in one of our 6th grade classes, a student who's ready for 3rd grade material to a student who's ready for 9th. And the question is, how do we personalize to meet those individual needs? What we do at Kairos is we take all of the objective content from a subject area and we organize it into a scope and sequence of modular objective work that students can master at their own pace, right? And so it just is true that in every subject there's right and wrong answer stuff you're going to have to learn. It is best if I can deliver that to you through the best instructors in the world and at the time that you're ready for. And then you show me that you've mastered that material by really mastering it, right? Not by saying, okay, take a quiz, you can get a 60% and move on and build these gaps in what you know, but by saying, you need to show me that you can get 80% of the questions right on this kind of topic, and then you can move forward. And you have, and I'll talk about this in a moment, an individual coach that helps guide you through that process. But that's just the foundation. The stuff that we really care about is the higher order work and the project-based learning. So personalized learning you can think about as a way to master these procedural or lower depth of knowledge skills. Project-based learning is about this idea that, in the real world, you never learn something just to learn it, right? You learn it with a purpose. You learn it because you want to apply those skills to a project that's meaningful for you, that's creative, that's often collaborative with other people. And so fitting with this theme that school should better prepare kids for the real world, we want our school to do that too. And so in every subject, in every unit, students are displaying what they learn, not just by regurgitating something, on a multiple choice test, but by applying those skills to something that's meaningful, creative, and collaborative. And that means if we're in geometry class and the rote skills that maybe I learned through my personalized learning are identifying, acute and obtuse angles and working on scale factors and ratios. And then we just ask ourselves the question, how do real adults use this information in the real world? Well, one example is architects, right? They're going to draw two-dimensional floor plans using these same concepts where they have to shrink things down, where they have to recognize different shapes and angles. And we're going to have our students design their own dream home. And if you ask any student, they'd much rather a teacher come in the class and say, hey, we're going to build a house, right? Than walk in the class and drone on at the whiteboard. And that's what that's really about, is one, motivation, but two, it's memory. So project-based learning, recognizes this neurological fact that humans can recall and remember things that are attached to stories or context much better than isolated facts, right? And we could get into the neuroscience research, but in layman's terms, it's just stickier when you can connect it to other memories. And so I still remember the living history project that I did in the 4th grade where I was Thomas Jefferson, because I can feel myself standing in that gym wearing this like oversized coat and scratchy beard and sweating and being nervous, and presenting to a crowd about why Thomas Jefferson had 3 things on his headstone, and none of them were that he was president of the United States, right? It said that he was drafter of the first, drafter of the Declaration of Independence, a member of the first Constitutional Congress, and a founder of UVA. And I still remember that to this day, not because I drilled flashcards, right? But because it is tagged in my mind with that memory of my nervousness and my sweatiness and my scratchy face, right? And that's something that's really key about project-based learning too. All of this relies on, and I'll get into what this means in 1 second, all of this relies on students having an individualized coach. So at Kairos, this is someone who is assigned to them at the beginning of school, and they are a one-on-one mentor for that student who meets with them 2 or 3 times a week at the beginning, especially, to develop a relationship, and then at least once a week after that to, not as a teacher, not as a tutor, right, but as someone who's there to nurture their executive functioning skills and to help them set their own path through their career at Kairos. Someone who is both an emotional mentor and someone who's there to guide the student, but who's also there to teach them the sort of brass tacks skills of, how do we take a big goal and break it down into smaller chunks, right? How do we make meaningful goals for ourselves? How do we keep a calendar that helps us achieve the aims that we've set, right? And through a constant feedback loop and lots of one-on-one time with that coach, who only is responsible for 10 kids, our kids work through that. And what I'm showing you here is how our students use the same tools that you or I might use in the real world. Their schedule is in Google Calendar, right? They all have email addresses, and okay, cool. It doesn't matter what we're using. The fact is that our students are learning how to keep a calendar. They're learning how to figure out what blocks of their time are flexible for them, and how they can leverage the time that's available to them to meet their goals, that they are familiar with the concept and with the tools they'll be using later on. Our students, like in college, already know how to email teachers and ask for help and ask to go to office hours, right? So if a student at Kairos is struggling with something and they're working on self-directed work, they know all they have to do is send Jen an email, which you can see here on the right side. This habituates, again, those tools, but mostly it's about those deeper executive functioning skills of knowing how to advocate for yourself, right? And of knowing how to be thoughtful about planning for your future. These are going to be some pictures of what it looks like to be at Kairos. And it'll help, I think, flesh out some of the concepts we've been talking about so far. So self-direction in the top left there, that's when students are working on their personalized learning. Students at Kairos, through the coaching structure, earn increasingly more choice over when, where, how, and with whom they work. So that, by the time they're juniors or seniors in college, in high school, they're basically functioning like college kids, where they have set classes that they sign up for during the day, and they have other unstructured time that they decide what to sign up for. Are they going to be, working independently in the library at that time? Are they going to be part of a drama club? Are they going to be meeting with the school newspaper over lunch? They earn the right to make those choices so that they can practice where they have the guidance of their coach and the guidance of caring teachers to help them before they get to college, right? That's what a self-direction class looks like. It's independent study. It's a student in the library. Students can rely on each other for help. And the hard part as a teacher during this time is that if you're in our library, you're going to hear a lot of really on-task discussions, but you're going to hear some off-task discussions. And so long as those students are not disrupting others' learning, it's actually not my charge to stop them. And the reason is that they have to be able to learn for themselves, right? They meet with a coach, they set their goals every week, and the accountability is going to come when they meet with their coach at the end of the week and they haven't met those goals. And they need to see the natural consequence of, well, I chose to talk during my work time instead of doing the things I needed to do, and I didn't hit my goals because of that. And then I'm not trusted with those kinds of choices, right? And so you earn choice or you lose choice on the basis of that. English class is, and any class you'll see, it has kids doing some of the more traditional work, right? They're gonna read novels, but they're reading Louis Sachar's Holes here for a project called Stories and Storyboards, where they adapt the themes in the book to create their own storyboard of a movie. This was a book that was made into a movie, and so they're following that process themselves. They're using the idea of theme and the work that they've done to read the book in the way that an adult might in the real world. They're building their own story. In science class, again, same idea. It's project-based. Students are running experiments, right? Like, we need to know what the conditions for thriving for biological systems are, because, like in this case, we might want to test which plants grow faster under which conditions, right? Because that's the way that scientists use that in the real world, or you and I in our garden, right? Group projects, often the projects I'm talking about above have a collective component. Students can check out the conference rooms that we have in our space, just like you might as an adult, and use that as a time to work together on things. This is a student, Jesse, in our lounge. It's during Kairos Reads and Writes time. It's just a time during the day that students have for reading for interest. They read any book they'd like. And then office hours we already discussed. So if you're struggling, we have a system set up where you can email your coach and say, hey, I need help with this. And you can get help from the appropriate department chair or teacher. That's just a little taste of what learning at Kairos looks like right now. Again, the kinds of tools that kids use, they know how to set their own goals. They know how to manage their time. And these are notes taken by one of our students about the building blocks of DNA. They're outline notes. And these are the kinds of constitutive skills that help someone be successful in the real world that just aren't taught in a traditional K-12 environment. So that's a little bit about what learning looks like at Kairos. Here are a couple of other pictures. A little bit about what the kind of structures we put in place for students are to help them succeed, and that are fundamentally different from a traditional education model. I'm going to talk in just a minute about the results of this in our first year and how that's happened, and then I'll move on to talking about how that's translated to our COVID response. I'm going to go ahead and pop over on my questions. For anyone who's coming in new, there's a link in the chat for questions. It's the same link that's right up here at the top of the slide. So if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to just type them right in there. They'll come to me, and then I can flash your question up for everybody. Thank you. Great. So moving on to results, we have two categories of results to share. The first are about academic achievement, right? So this is the dollars and cents of the education world, the hardest numbers that we have. And I want to be really clear that standardized test scores do not capture even close to the whole vision of what a Kairos student is, but they are necessary to unlock a lifetime of choice, right? A lifetime of opportunity. So we do need to have mastered these core skills in order to have the world as our oyster. And so we use something called the NWEA map, and it measures growth for us on math, language, and reading over time. And as a first-year school with our first class of 6th graders, we're looking at a test in September that measures a baseline of sort of where they were when they came in, and then a test in February. And the results I'm going to be sharing are the growth that we see there. So how does that compare to other schools? Awesome. And I see a question coming up here. I'm going to save that for right after this results section because I think it'll fit better with that. Thank you. So here we are at the results of our sort of academic scores. If you look at reading, language, and math, our students grew at a rate that was from 1.5 to 2.7 times faster than the national average during that period. Another way to think about that is that 1 times growth would mean that they were keeping pace to grow 1 year's worth of material in a year. So if we were to keep this pace through the end of the year, our students would grow almost 3 years in reading, 2 years in language, and 1.5 years in math. Coupled with this, and something we're really proud of, is that our subgroups that we look at in education, so students who have historically, students for whom there's historically an achievement gap, are either on pace with that average or performing above it. One highlight from that is that our students with disabilities actually grew faster than 95% of their peers nationwide for reading comprehension, right? So this is something we're really proud of, and I think speaks to the idea that of the power of a personalized education, that it can be, it can fit the needs of anyone on the spectrum, from very high achieving to students who need lots of additional supports and scaffolds, and can help them grow and reach their maximum potential, and that's our goal. The next set of slides, oh, I'm sorry, we'll do this first. So this is an ugly slide, I'll admit, but a comparison that I think is really valuable. So we're part of something called the Charter School Growth Fund Invent Portfolio. The Charter School Growth Fund's a national funding organization that supports the highest performing schools across the country. And they have supported our work, and this is how we compare to their cohort of schools. So you can look at, on the left graph our math, on the right reading. Growth is along the x-axis, and absolute academic achievement is along the y-axis. And so for math, we are about middle of the road for both achievement and growth, if not a little bit ahead of the average for growth. For reading, we are performing phenomenally. And so our charge is to figure out how do we make sure that our students are making the kind of growth in math that we're already seeing in reading in our first 6 months as a school. And I'll be totally candid with you. These first 6 months should be our worst 6 months as a school ever, right? Because we are an organization that is built on this idea of iterative improvement and growth. And so we are not satisfied with this. It's not where we want to end up, but very encouraged that even in those first 6 months, our most challenging 6 months, we're seeing real meaningful growth for kids that compares favorably to some of the best schools in the country. We'll move on to our second set of measures. Again, I said standardized test results are not a holistic measure of whether a student can be successful in the world, and then not a holistic measure of what we care about. We use something called Panoramas, Climate and Culture and Social Emotional Surveys. Panorama is a national organization that gives surveys to, I think, somewhere between 8 and 10 million students every year. They survey staff, students, and families as well across a number of metrics. So climate and culture are things like school safety, relationships with teachers, those kind of factors. If we're talking about social emotional learning, we're talking about a student's self-assessment of qualities like grit and growth mindset and emotional regulation. And these different question banks and groups are vetted by the Harvard School of Education as well. So sort of the best in class measures for this kind of work. And what you can see for Kairos, there's a little more explanation on that. I think I covered most of it. One data point we're really, really proud of is that, compared to the millions of other students who take this across the country, Kairos students ranked their student-teacher relationships in the 90th percentile of their peers nationwide, right? So our Kairos students feel closer with their teachers than 90% of the students who take this across the country. And again, a sample of 8 to 10 million students. This is really meaningful for us because we focus on those one-on-one individual relationships through the coach. That coach actually stays with you. I didn't mention this over 6th, 7th, and 8th grade and builds a relationship with your family. And fundamental to a student being successful in school is them feeling like they have caring adults there in the building who can guide them and they can rely on. So that's really important data point for us. The next point are sort of parent survey data, which really blew us out of the water. So our parents rated us with 80% of our parents taking the survey in the top 1% nationwide for 3 categories: school safety, learning and climate, and ease of engagement. Now, each one of those has 10 to 15 questions associated with that, and it's a factor analysis. But again, out of 8 to 10 million students and families across the country, our families rated us in the 99th percentile, right? We rated higher than 99% of schools across the country for these 3 categories. And coming back to this point about integration and diversity, our students, our parents, I think one of the things that makes our community unique is that we are an intentionally integrated school. It's a rare thing in St. Louis. We're one of 3 intentionally integrated schools in the city. And we're in a neighborhood that ranks among the lowest performing across the country. And we're intentionally trying to build a coalition of parents who wouldn't otherwise bump elbows, right? Who wouldn't otherwise meet each other, and a coalition of students as well. And because of that intentional focus, we have a school with no more than 55% of any one racial group. There are a couple of our other demographic statistics here you can read. I won't read them out to you. And we're one of only 2 schools in St. Louis that was recognized by the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition. Again, we think this work is as critical as what we're doing to reorganize what students are learning in the school, because in an increasingly diversifying world, if you don't know how to work across lines of difference, you're falling behind. And that's from a really practical standpoint. From an ethical standpoint, we know students who go to diverse schools are less likely to hold negative racial biases about people who don't look like them. They're more likely to work in integrated workplaces and integrated jobs, to live in integrated neighborhoods. And they actually do better on a whole host of metrics. And it doesn't matter which background you come from. If you go to a diverse school, you do better. You have a better ACT score. You have a higher percentage acceptance rate to college, a higher 4-year graduation rate from college, and higher long-term lifetime earnings, which again are just some really brass tacks numbers. There's obviously an ethical reason, a very strong ethical reason to work and learn together, but there's a practical reason as well, which is it's just better for kids. If you're being challenged by students who come from different backgrounds than you do and have a different perspective, you're smarter for it, right? You're better for it. And that's, I think, really key. I see a lot of questions coming up here. So let's see, I think this is our last slide, and then I'll hit a couple of those before we go on to how this tracks with our COVID-19 response, why our students have been so successful under those terms. So the last part here is one of the key measures we track for student social emotional competencies is called social perspective taking. That's the ability to consider the perspectives of others. And we think that's related to our integrated student body, but also because of our intentional restorative justice approach. We focus on the relationship as the foundational unit of success for the culture of the school. We do things called relationship work, so structured conversation between students mediated by an adult, where we teach them, here's how you resolve a conflict, here's how you work towards a solution. Apologize. We do a practice called Circle, which is an hour we have set aside every week to come together as essentially a homeroom and check in with each other, see how we're doing emotionally, right? To share major life updates. There's a section of Circle, this is my favorite time of the week, called Appreciations, where you just call someone else into the circle, you share what it is that you appreciate that they've done for you that week, or that they did that week, what that tells you about them as a person and how it connects you, right? And so we are intentionally trying to build this skill of stepping into other people's shoes. Our students moved from the 50th percentile when we surveyed this question in September, at the beginning of the year, to the 80th percentile, so the top 20% in the nation on this core skill. And we think that's largely due to that intentional restorative justice approach. So I see a couple questions coming up here, and I'm going to go ahead and yeah, so I'm going to present a couple of these. Can I get some nods if you can see that question? Thank you, Maria. Great. So how are students selected for admittance to Kairos? Thank you, Maria. So as a public charter school, we are entirely open enrollment, right? That means that there is no test to get into Kairos. There's no cost to attend the school to families. And we have a lottery system for admittance. So let's say we have 100 seats for next year, which we do for our 6th grade class. Parents apply over the course of the year before our lottery date. And if we have more parents who want those seats, then we have spots available. It's a random lottery to decide who gets in. So there are 120 parents and 100 seats. It's random to decide who gets those 100 seats. There's a quick caveat to that is that we are allowed by the state of Missouri to put some preference ranking order within our lottery. So technically we have 3 lotteries. We have one first, which is siblings of current students, right? And so we have a pool of, let's say, if there were 100 siblings of current students, all of them would get in and nobody else would get in first. The second level are students who live in the zip codes 63111, 63116, and 63118. Those are the 3 target zip codes for our local community and the area in St. Louis, which is struggling most with quality educational options. And so those students get preference after that. It's pretty big. It's about a quarter of the city of St. Louis. And then after that, anyone at all in the city of St. Louis. And we wish that it was open to students in the county as well. The way the Missouri charter law is written right now, only students who live in the city of St. Louis, in the city of Kansas City, and I think one other municipality are allowed to attend charter schools. There's a couple caveats to that. One is that if you are in an unaccredited school district, you're allowed to attend a charter school in the city of St. Louis. And if you are part of the voluntary interdistrict transfer program. So you are, which is formerly the desegregation program. So if you are a white student who lives in the county, you can attend Kairos. Hope that answers that question. Maria, if it doesn't, feel free to hop on and share anything else. Okay, I've got a couple other questions here I want to hit before we go down. Related to that question, how much is tuition? We don't have tuition. We would like to open schools in the county, but again, we can't based on the way that the Missouri charter law is written. We can only open schools in the county if it's an unaccredited school district. And then I see, let's see this one here. Can your model be accomplished through incremental change of the existing industrial complex model, or does it require revolutionary overhaul? So this is actually the question that I'm about to get to next, which is how do we take these principles and try to make sure that they are in as many school buildings as possible? And I'm not saying classrooms on purpose, because I think actually the school building is the fundamental unit of change for a child's education. We often in education silo ourselves classroom to classroom, and there are just certain things that have to be accomplished at the building level. So I'm going to talk about in one moment, if you don't mind me waiting on this, Anonymous, I'm sorry for whoever posted that, to share what our growth plan is and how we plan to expand, but also how we hope to share some of these best practices across the broader education community in St. Louis and nationwide. So I'll go ahead and hide that. And let's see if there's anything else on here that's new. What data point presents the biggest challenge? If I'm understanding the question correctly, I assume this means like, what piece of data do we have that is something we most want to address? I think that the most important piece of feedback, or one of the most important pieces of feedback we've gotten from our school, is that parents are really happy, I think, with, and Tony, maybe you can talk to this, but parents are really happy, I think, with the level of engagement they get from their coach and from our staff in terms of updating them on where their kid is. The coach, again, sends out an update to parents every week via text message, the goals they're working on, the things that they're doing. They meet with the parent or have a phone call once a cycle, and we have 7 cycles during the year. But there aren't as many opportunities in our school as we're sort of building capacity around that for parent engagement around volunteering, around fundraising, around some of the like traditional, this is a middle school dance kind of stuff. I think that's sort of a function of being a first-year school and something we're working really hard on with our PTO. Other data points that present a challenge, I mean, I think the math data point I shared presents a challenge, right? Because even though it's above the bar of average growth for students, we know that we need to be making, that many of our students are behind, and we need to be making greater than average growth across the board. And so we'd like that number to look a lot more like our reading comprehension growth. We're working on that really intentionally. Right now, we have a big focus on reading because it's sort of the master variable, right? If you can't read, it's very difficult to grasp and learn new concepts. Reading comprehension in a way affects your learning across every other domain of study. And so some of the strategies we put in place around reading, like having 3 periods a week that are separate, that are designed to get students into independent reading, we call it Kairos Reads and Writes Time, what we're looking to implement in math as well. So we'd call that Kairos Solves. It'd be specific small group targeted math interventions. So I think that about covers most of our questions. We'll talk a little bit about how this expands out moving forward. But let's go to the next slide for right now. So families across the country are seeing firsthand how unprepared their kids are to succeed outside of the artificial environment of traditional schooling right now, right? So they're outside of a classroom, they're working from home in many capacities, and no real world setting, right? Not remote working, which is basically what our kids are doing now, not an information age career, and certainly not college looks like the average K-12 classroom. And so students today are discovering a hard truth that most only learn after graduation. And this is what I sort of began the slide presentation with, right? My students who got to college and were like overwhelmed by the amount of choice that they had and how to manage that choice. So this is the hard truth that they're sort of contending with, is that their education didn't really teach them how to navigate real life choices over when, where, how, and with whom to work, right? And our choice structure at Kairos and our one-on-one coaching and our intentional focus on executive functioning development has given our students the tools to be successful in this work from home environment. Again, a place where most adults are struggling today, right? And so Kairos, our regular school, and Kairos oikoi, oikoi is ancient Greek for sort of at home, so it's Kairos at home, are both really designed to empower students to direct their own lives and learning, not to be dependent on the teacher in the room for the next direction and exactly what to do. So our kids have transitioned pretty seamlessly to remote learning. You can ask our parents about that one. Some of them are on the call if they're willing to chat about it when we get to the discussion section. Not because really they're any smarter than other children, although we do adore our kids, they're wonderful, but because they've spent the time intentionally building executive functioning skills. Kairos students learn how to learn independently. The only way anyone really learns anything, which is with one-on-one coaching and a lot of authentic practice. And in our case, these self-directed studies through real-world challenges and incentives. Among its lessons, the pandemic has really taught us that the question isn't whether our children will need to take ownership of their education, their work, and their life. It's how, as adults, we're going to prepare them for that challenge. And that's what we really see this moment as at Kairos. It's sort of, it's a wake-up call to parents and families that the traditional education system is not preparing students to work in ways that they'll be asked to as adults. And this is just one example. And so our goal is to provide sort of a case point and a study for schools across the country on how to do this well, not just during Kairos Oikoi, but moving forward. And so you can see on this slide deck, which will be shared out with everyone, our learning plan for Kairos Oikoi, some of the independent studies we've done, and some of the materials that we'll share about that. That includes, for parents out there, some really great digital resources that we use with kids that are very engaging and can promote and foster that kind of self-directed orientation. And so my last slide in here, we're getting to one of the questions we hit earlier, is how can we expand access to this model of education? And the basic premise is that every child deserves the right to be in a place that teaches them how to direct their own lives and learning, with personalized instruction, with a world-class curriculum, that it actually is unfair in some fundamental way that we have to operate on a lottery basis, right? And that a lottery should decide, who gets access to this kind of thing. So our goal is to expand our own capacity as fast as we can do so with fidelity, right? And so the first stage of that is a big middle school, to increase our middle school class size by 50 to 100%. Right now we have 110 students in our, 112, I think, in our 6th grade class right now. We're adding another 100 6th graders next year. We'd like to actually double that size, and whether that's opening a separate middle school with 100 kids in a class, or having some kind of dual school here at our current site, that's a big priority for us. Middle school is really the time where students are in the developmentally appropriate range to start taking on some of those choices for themselves and really building that executive functioning skill. The next sort of stage of this is a new high school that would provide a continuing education for all of our middle school students now. So we'll provide an option that rolls from 6th through 12th grade. Then a micro little, as I put here, but a micro elementary school with 10 to 20 students for prototyping. What does this look like with students, grades kindergarten through 5, right? It's going to be a fundamentally different model. It may or may not rely as much on technology. It's likely to look a little bit more like a traditional Montessori model, right? But really getting that right is the next big step for us, because if we can get students in 1st grade before the achievement gap starts to take hold, before there's our big skill gaps that we have to remediate when it comes into 6th grade, we'll be in a much better position to help students build choice and build executive function when they get to the developmentally appropriate age. And the last is share out. So how do we leverage what we have at Kairos to share with other schools and try to put pressure on the system to change, right? We are fortunate in that we're a small organization and we can make radical shifts and try to serve the needs of our students. But the real challenge is, how do you get a district of 30,000 kids to start implementing some of this work? How can we share the curriculum and resources we use with them to hopefully give more kids access to this kind of thing? Because it's not that there's no lack in education of really hardworking, really dedicated teachers and leaders. What there's a lack of is access to the kind of model that will best serve them and best serve their kids. So the last part of this, and this kind of fits into this trajectory of how do we expand our capacity to meet the needs of a broader student population. It's through partnership. These are some of the partners we work with already. And if this is something that you would be interested in, please email either myself, jack@kairosacademies.org, or email our CEO. The address is listed there with ideas that you have. You can also visit our website. It's kairosacademies.org for information about enrollment, information about how to join our faculty, and information about teaching and learning opportunities with other districts. So I'm going to open up the floor now. I know we already took a couple of our questions to see if there are any new questions people can post right in the box.